Welcome, friends. Welcome back to the kitchen. Welcome back to Sunday morning in the old cookbook show. On Wednesday, I opened 2 packages of fresh cookbooks that came in. And I decided that I would pick a recipe from one of the cookbooks and we would make it today. So I chose a recipe from this cookbook. This is Choice Recipes. It's from the Walter Baker Company. Walter Baker makes Baker's chocolate. Baker's chocolate isn't for bakers. It's Baker '(S), showing ownership. It was his company. Baker owned the company, Baker's Chocolate. Anyway, and so this cookbook is from 1916. Very interesting little cookbook. Recipes from a whole bunch of food stars from the time period. The recipe that we're going to make is Miss Rohrer's chocolate cake. Now, this came with a whole bunch of cookbooks from over there. This cookbook came in a separate package, and it is Mrs. Rohrer's Philadelphia cookbook. So obviously, we're going to make Mrs. Rohrer's chocolate cake today. I'm going to clear this all away, get set up, and we'll start baking the cake. Okay, so few things. The recipe in both the Walter Baker book and Mrs. Rohrer's book, exactly the same. They had made no changes. And I find it very interesting that this Baker's chocolate book is not edited. And what I mean by that is really in these early advertising pamphlets, the books were edited to one voice. Didn't matter who had been making the recipes. There was an editor who put it in one voice, one style of recipe, ingredients, method, so on and so forth. Made sure that all of the amounts were given in the same way. If they're going to use ounces, they would use ounces throughout. In this case, the recipes are put in, they're just lifted straight from the cookbooks of the other authors, with permission, I'm sure. And they're not edited down to put them into one voice. They're presented in the voice of the person who wrote the recipe. So Fannie Farmer's in this baker's book. All of her recipes are written the way that Fannie Farmer writes a recipe. Mrs. Rohrer's recipe is in here. It's written in the way that Mrs. Rohrer writes a recipe. And what I find very interesting is, and this is the next elephant in the room, some of the recipes call for chocolate based in ounces, and some of the recipes call for chocolate based in squares. Now, if you hadn't, this is all broken. This is all broken to pieces. Let me see if I've got another one. Okay, let's see. It's unfortunate that that's all broken up. I don't buy Baker's brand chocolate much anymore because I find that value for money just isn't there anymore. Let's see if I can, this one's better. Okay, so let's put that aside. Use that somewhere else. Where was I? Baker's chocolate. So some recipes call for chocolate by the ounce, some call for it by the square. Baker's chocolate wasn't the first to market in the United States or North America. But they certainly were the dominant force. They became the biggest very quickly. And their way of packaging the chocolate into little squares that were 1 ounce in size. There is a correlation there. 1 square equals 1 ounce. Because they were the biggest and they spent so much money on these books were everywhere, that other brands of chocolate started making their chocolate in the same sized square. 1 square equals 1 ounce, to make it easy for the consumer just to buy any brand of chocolate and use it in the recipes, even though the recipe books were given out by bakers. Now, sometime in the last decade, bakers changed the way they manufactured their chocolate and went to a bar instead of individually wrapped squares. And when they did that, this now equals 1 ounce of chocolate, 4 smaller pieces, rather than 1 square. Still weighs an ounce. And it even says so on the packaging. You would be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't be amazed, at how many people leave comments who are totally caught out by this. They didn't understand that a square of chocolate equals 1 ounce, that there was a correlation there in measurement. And when they see the new packaging, they take... Can I break it? They take 1/4 of an ounce, and they think that's a square of chocolate, even though it's written right on the face of it, 1/4 ounce. I don't know. Anyway, so I don't know where I was going with that. That's a bit of a rant. Anyway, bakers, first to market or largest to market very early on, they sort of dictated that a square of chocolate equals 1 ounce, and that's carried on for 100 and some years until about a decade ago when everybody changed their manufacturing. And nobody, I don't think at this point, anyway, that I've seen in probably the last 5 years, still makes chocolate in that square format. Now, I was supposed to melt the chocolate in some boiling water. The water has cooled down in the time it took me to talk through that, so I might just stick this in the microwave. Melting chocolate in water always kind of weirds me out because it breaks the chocolate. It breaks the chocolate. Okay, so next we're going to move on. It becomes almost a conventional cake at this point. We're going to cream together the butter and the sugar. Okay, well that's creaming together. Got a measuring cup and the copper bowl. Gonna need the copper bowl. So I need a 1/2 cup of milk. There we go. Okay, I'm gonna reread the recipe because, you know, just have to be sure. Dissolve the chocolate in 5 tablespoons of boiling water. Cream butter, add sugar gradually, didn't do that. Add the yolks and beat again, then the milk. Then the melted chocolate and flour. Okay, so we need to separate the eggs. Yolks into there, whites into here. They're going to be beaten separately. Egg whites, egg yolks. Okay, let's get things kind of arranged here. Next goes in the milk. Once the milk is in, then the chocolate. Now we spoon in the flour. I guess this really isn't standard cake method. Normally you would alternate liquid and flour back and forth. This didn't say to do that. And the baking powder and the vanilla haven't been put in yet either. So I take back my earlier statement, not standard cake. Okay, that's the last of the flour. I'm going to turn the mixer off for now, and we are going to whip our egg whites. Now the egg whites are looking really good. It's time to fold them in, although it says to stir them carefully in. I guess the term fold hadn't really come into use yet. As much as I can fold them in carefully, or stir them in carefully, there's still a lot of mixing to do. I still have to put in the vanilla and the baking powder. So I'm going to be as careful as I can, but I think we're still going to lose whatever air we've whipped into those egg whites. This is kind of one of those recipes, as I look through some of the other recipes in this book for cakes, where Mrs. Rory is kind of she's got a foot in 2 different baking methods. One where cakes were previously leavened mostly with egg whites. And then the New World, which by the time this book was published had been around maybe 50 years, baking soda and baking powder. And so she uses both. In a lot of her recipes, she uses both. And I imagine that there would be some cooks at the time this book was published that might not yet trust baking soda or baking powder to do the job. Okay, I'm going to put in the vanilla at this point. and the baking powder. Putting the baking powder in at this point kind of worries me a little bit. I hope that it doesn't clump. Putting it in earlier with the flour would mean that it would be incorporated really well and it wouldn't clump, and I'm sure it's going to work. I'm sure she knows exactly what she's doing. She's a cookbook author after all. Now, doesn't say what size pan. I've got a 9x9. I've greased it and I put a parchment sling in it just to make it easier to get out later. And so in this goes into the cake pan. The oven is preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, a moderate oven. 9x9 might not have been big enough. It doesn't say. Turn into well-greased cake pan and bake in a moderate oven 45 minutes. So in it goes.
Hoorah, it's time for cake. Hey, friends. Hey, Glenn.
Hey, Jules. So, Mrs. Rohrer's chocolate cake.
Okay.
It appears in 2 cookbooks
Oh.
that arrived in the mail from 2 different people.
Oh, 2 different regions of the...
2 different parts of the world.
Huh.
Okay, here we
This is
go.
Roar.
Mm-hmm. Light, fluffy.
It's a chocolate cake. It's kind of like a white cake, chocolate cake.
Yeah. Really light and fluffy. Didn't take nearly as long to bake as it says in the recipes. Modern oven, completely different. Could use a little bit of
Icing.
chocolate icing. A little bit of chocolate icing. But, I mean, it's a good chocolate cake. Mrs. Rohrer makes great chocolate cake. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.
Yes, we're not alone in saying that.